So this is a real move by Putin. And honestly, it looks as though nobody is really willing to stop him. And that really should not be a surprise. I mean, the fact is that Joe Biden and his predecessor, Barack Obama, and the Democratic Party in the Oval Office were extremely conciliatory toward Moscow. I know we're all going to pretend now that this is all about Trump, but there is something to the fact that nothing happened between Russia and Ukraine for the entire period of Donald Trump's presidency. He was too unpredictable for Putin to actually peg down. Putin didn't know what to do with Trump. He did know what to do with the Democrats. You'll recall that it was during the 2012 election. By the way, this country would have been so much better if Mitt Romney had been elected in 2012. I cannot even name the ways. There are 1 million ways in which this country would have been far superior if Barack Obama had lost his reelect effort in 2012. From the critical race theory orientation of the left in the United States to our foreign policy, this country would be so much better to our national. Like one of the great modern tragedies of history is that Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama in 2012. It's just a devastating inflection point in American history. I really believe this, that the 2012 election was a super important election that people still have not fully gauged the impact of. In any case, in 2012, Barack Obama was literally caught on a hot mic with the then Russian puppet controlled by Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. And he said to him, "If you guys leave me alone until the election, I will provide you flexibility after the election." Within 2 years, Russia had invaded Ukraine. And you'll recall that this became an issue at the debates between Obama and Romney because Romney had been asked who was America's chief geopolitical foe in 2012. And Romney said, Vladimir Putin. And Barack Obama's answer was, well, why are you still living in the 80s? Well, I mean, he wasn't. And Barack Obama, it was a stupid line at the time, and the media cheered it because the media are a bunch of sycophantic, slobbering jackasses who just massage the buttocks of the Democratic Party. Here was Barack Obama making a fool of himself. Most of us saw this at the time. But in retrospect, he looks particularly foolish.
Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that al-Qaeda is a threat. Because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. But, Governor, when it comes to our foreign policy, you seem to want to import the foreign policies of the 1980s, just like the social policies of the 1950s and the economic policies of the 1920s.
I mean, it's absurd. Okay. And he's cheered for this. And Joe Biden, whose chief job in 2012 was to be the bloviating dolt that he was, but, with full control of his bloviating idiotic capacities. I'm not sure which was scarier, Joe Biden in control of his capacity or Joe Biden not in control of his capacity like he is now. This is Joe Biden in 2012 talking up the myriad wonders of Vladimir Putin.
So, and the second thing is, Governor Romney's answer, I thought, was incredibly revealing. He acts like he thinks the Cold War is still on. Russia is still our major adversary. I don't know where he's been. I mean, we have disagreements with Russia, but they're united with us on Iran. The only way one of only two ways we're getting material into Afghanistan to our troops is through Russia. They are working closely with us. They've just said to Europe, if there is an oil shutdown in any way in the Gulf, they'll consider increasing oil supplies to Europe. This is not 1956.
It's not 1956, guys. I mean, when tanks rolled in to Hungary from Russia, now you just have tanks that are rolling across the border of Ukraine. It's completely different, guys. Completely different. And now the White House keeps signaling that they think that Vladimir Putin might go for even more. And so Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, who also served under Barack Obama, he says that Russia is planning an extremely violent move.
We believe that any military operation of the size, scope, and magnitude of what we believe the Russians are planning will be extremely violent. It will cost the lives of Ukrainians and Russians, civilians and military personnel alike. But we also have intelligence to suggest that there will be an even greater form of brutality because this will not simply be some conventional war between two armies. It will be a war waged by Russia on the Ukrainian people to repress them, to crush them, to harm them.
So how exactly is the West going to respond to any of that if Putin decides to go further? And how will the West respond right now when the simple fact is that the Putin-backed Russian forces have already essentially invaded? The invasion may already be over and we're not even talking about it. It may be that Putin already got his goal. which was to effectuate the seizure of these particular territories in Ukraine because he wishes to actually use this as a pattern in order to foment exactly the sort of thing in some of the Baltic republics that are members of NATO. So he can break up NATO without actually having to fire a direct shot across the bow with regard to NATO. So how's the United States responding to this? Well, we did deploy Kamala Harris, one of our great minds on both domestic and foreign policy, to Munich to talk about what to do about Russia. And as always, she was a wild success. As she is with everything that she does, she's extraordinarily articulate. She knows exactly what she's talking about. She has solutions to all of our problems. Or alternatively, she's never read a briefing book because she has cruised on her ambition and her intersectional bona fides for literally her entire career. And so she has no idea what the hell she's doing. So here's Kamala Harris being asked a question and just completely falling short as per our usual arrangement.
As the president talked about in his speech, we are aware that, again, when America stands for her principles and all of the things that we hold dear, it requires sometimes for us to put ourselves out there in a way that maybe we will incur some cost. And in this situation, that may relate to energy costs, for example. But we are taking very specific and appropriate, I believe, steps to mitigate what that cost might be if it happens.
Now, what's hilarious about this answer is what she was asked was, will this all deter Russia? And she says yes. And then she was asked, well, it hasn't deterred Russia. And she's like, right, but it might. And also, I don't know what I'm talking about. She's so intensely bad at this. And so it's kind of a mess. So you have Jen Psaki from the White House yesterday saying, we'll impose some new sanctions. So what exactly are those sanctions going to be? Are they going to be the world-crushing sanctions that we were supposed to see, where Russia was cut off from, for example, the SWIFT international banking system? No, not quite that. So she says, we have anticipated a move like this from Russia and are ready to respond immediately. President Biden will soon issue an executive order that will prohibit new investment, trade, and financing by U.S. persons to, from, or in the so-called DNR and LNR regions of Ukraine. So we're going to issue sanctions against any U.S. people who are involved in funding Donetsk and Luhansk. This EO will also provide authority to impose sanctions on any person determined to operate in those areas of Ukraine. The Departments of State and Treasury will have additional details shortly. We will also soon announce additional measures related to today's blatant violation of Russia's international commitments. To be clear, these measures are separate from and would be in addition to the swift and severe economic measures we have been preparing in coordination with allies and partners should Russia further invade Ukraine. We are continuing to work closely with our allies and partners, including Ukraine, on next steps and on Russia's ongoing escalation along the border with Ukraine. So, no crushing sanctions in response to what Putin just did, which is effectively annex a couple of territories more, right? He took Crimea back in 2014. So now he's going to essentially just annex these parts of eastern Ukraine. And we'll issue sanctions on those parts of Ukraine, but not on Russia directly, and not on Putin, and not on any of his cronies, and not on the oligarchs. None of that. The logic here from the left is constantly, well, we can't actually issue the sanctions because once we've issued the sanctions, then our threat to issue the sanctions is gone. Okay, well, that is what we would call in law school an argument that proves too much. It means that you should never issue sanctions. Because if all you have, the only bullet you have in the chamber is these sanctions and nothing else, then when exactly do you activate, when you've pulled the trigger? Like, they've not made clear at any point here. The other thing you could do is you could just hit them with the world-crushing sanctions now and say those will be relieved the moment that you stop this nonsense. That is what Donald Trump did with Iran, for example. So the logic of the left here and from the Biden administration seems to be if we do too much here, then what are we going to threaten them with later? And the answer is if you just keep threatening and you never do it, then Russia knows that the threat is empty. Here is Adam Schiff, fresh off of his Russia collusion catastrophe, explaining Russia policy on CNN.
I think that once you've imposed sanctions, you lose whatever leverage you have by threatening, hey, if you go forward, this is what we're going to do. Once you've imposed sanctions, then Russia's in the position of saying, well, then we might as well go forward. We're already suffering the penalties.
Okay, or alternatively, if they're that crushing, then they should want them relieved. This idea that you hold everything you have in abeyance with regard to economic sanctions. Economic sanctions, by the way, I'm not aware that economic sanctions have ever actually effectuated serious change in foreign policy. I really, can you name a time when there's a book that came out recently reviewed by the Wall Street Journal, the name escapes me, talking about the history of economic sanctions. Even with regard to South Africa apartheid, it didn't actually end South African apartheid. That was domestic conversation and unrest and all the rest that led to the inevitable opening of South Africa as it should have. But it was not primarily sanctions that led to that. Economic sanctions have had very little effect with regard to effectuating foreign policy goals in this area. According to the New York Times, the limited nature of the initial sanctions appeared intended to allow the United States and its European allies to hold in reserve the more aggressive sanctions they've been threatening to impose on Moscow if Putin sends Russian armed forces into Ukraine, and to allow for the increasingly slim possibility of a diplomatic solution. The European allies condemned the Russian action as a violation of international law, but the relative restraint of the American steps could also reflect debates among the allies over what action by Russia should trigger the full sanctions, and the difficulty of developing a unified and proportional response to incremental steps by Vladimir Putin. Well, I mean, that's right. When you issue very, very weak sanctions, that really does betray that NATO is not together, which is what Biden betrayed because he said it out loud just a couple of weeks ago. And Biden had said it in a conference call. Right? The administration said that Russian troops in Donetsk and Luhansk alone may not warrant swift and severe sanctions that the administration has been previewing thus far. Now, what they could be doing is sanctioning the oligarchs. So Russian oligarchs have been lobbying the foreign offices not to sanction them. And so far, they've not been sanctioned. Maybe they should be sanctioned. Maybe we should go after the oligarchs who really are the powers in Russia because they're the ones with all of the money. Germany, for its part, has suspended the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. They've taken steps to halt the process of certifying Nord Stream 2, according to Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Scholz said his government made the decision in response to Russian President Vladimir Putin's recognition of the independence of two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine that he said marked a serious break of international law. Now, the reality is we never should have greenlit Nord Stream 2 in the first place. What we should have done is said, if you want Nord Stream 2, then you need to never, ever go across those borders again. You need to stop that. And then we'll discuss Nord Stream 2. Now we are going to go from the position that you're going to be good actors when the evidence is that you're bad actors all the way through. Because here's what Putin is gaming out. What Putin is gaming out, if he has any brain at all, which he does, is, okay, so they halt production for like a second. But in the long term, Europe does not have the capacity to provide its own power. They've hamstrung themselves. They've stopped creating nuclear power plants. They got rid of coal. They got rid of natural gas. They got rid of oil. Their power is way too expensive. And so they need cheap natural gas from somewhere. So they can cut off their nose to spite their face. But you really think in like a year from now, the domestic population in Germany is going to be willing to pay twice their energy price because they don't want Nord Stream 2 because of Donetsk and Luhansk? This is the actual calculation that Putin is going through. And here's the thing. He's probably right. He's probably right. Because the West did not stand up to him. Now, listen, I'm not going to pretend that this is all of the West making. It's of Vladimir Putin's making primarily. But none of this happens if the West is not perceived as fragmented and weak, and that happened under Joe Biden. It is not a coincidence that the pullout from Afghanistan happened just a few months ago, and right after that, Putin started getting extraordinarily aggressive on Ukraine's border. Right now, China's sitting it out, by the way, because China's sort of waiting aside to see what happens here. China's figuring, okay, if Putin doesn't get slapped with too much here, then maybe we make a very aggressive move on Taiwan. If, however, Putin really gets slapped down, then maybe we'll wait on it a little bit. But it doesn't seem like the West is mobilizing in fashion harsh enough to actually prevent Putin from doing the Hong Kong on these eastern areas of Ukraine, announcing some sort of domestic rule whereby he can then leverage that into full-scale control of areas of other countries or of other territories that were promised independence by treaty. Afghanistan remains in the background of everybody's mind here. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date with all our future content.